Hello and welcome. This is Down to Astro. I'm Chani Nicholas.
I'm Thea Anderson.
And I'm Eliza Robertson.
In this podcast, we like to look at the current astrology and then talk about how it's landing, what's coming up, and then we like to give a little bit of homework. But in this episode, we're actually going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at the upcoming year. We're recording this on November 30th of 2023, and we're going to be talking about some of, not all of, because it's very complex and it would take us 7 million hours. But we're going to talk about some of the bigger highlights of 2024, what we have got our eye on, what we're looking out for, what we're excited about. And just to say, if you want a really detailed reading about all of this, you can go to the Chani app and go to the Your Year section of the app. And I've got readings for your sign specific, situation. And there's 4 readings, 1 for each quarter of the year. Okay, y'all.
Wait, and if you want that in written form, we do have guidebooks.
Oh, do we have guidebooks? We have digital guidebooks for your sign. You can get your rising sign, your sun sign, both, either, whatever. And Eliza's team at the Chani app has spent 1 gajillion hours specifically.
Exactly 1 gajillion.
1 gajillion writing the most incredible detailed report you can get on the interwebs. And they're gorgeous. They are filled with beautiful art. They're filled with homework. They are filled with rituals. They are filled with suggestions. They could not be more in-depth. And we just thank the entire content team at the Chani app for writing those. You can go to chani.com and buy everybody in your life one. It's a great, great gift for any reason whatsoever.
And if you like to go analog, you can get the planner for 2024. Hey. So I think what we're saying is we got y'all for next year.
Also, a lot of people print out the guidebook. Mm. They tag me. They print it out because it's so beautiful. And then they have it in print too. So you can do all that. All right, y'all. What are we excited about in 2024? Go.
Should we start with Jupiter Uranus?
Yeah.
It feels like one of the most stunning moments of next year.
Mm-hmm. When is it? What is a Jupiter? What is a Uranus? What is a Jupiter Uranus?
So Jupiter and Uranus will join each other. They'll form a conjunction in the sign Taurus on April 20th, 2024. Jupiter is the planet we associate with wisdom, with expansion and growth and abundance and plenty and fairness traditionally, as well as temperance. Actually, we always associate Jupiter in modern astrology as being like this gourmand, like this jolly, slightly hedonistic figure. But traditionally, Jupiter was actually known to be very temperate and associated with justice.
Yeah. I think of it as kind of relaxing too, in a way.
Yeah, especially in Taurus.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
It's the greater benefic. So this is one of the most helpful planets in astrology. And it is making a conjunction with Uranus. Uranus is the first planet beyond Saturn. What that means is it's the first planet we can't see with our naked eye. So it has this connotation of breakthroughs, of kind of, taking the glass ceiling and smashing through it. It can be very avant-garde. It can be very forward thinking and innovative. It can also be very disruptive and full of surprise and volatility. But with very loud, yes. But what I find it's one of those wild card planets that the flavor of what happens can be very dependent on the planets it's talking to. So I do feel optimistic. I feel cautiously optimistic, let's say that, about this conjunction with Jupiter, because it is conjoining with like such a positive planet.
Right. Theo, how do you see it?
Well, if we're going to talk about the most exciting astrology of the year, I think it's appropriate that we begin with Uranus because it is a smash, and it's like a revolutionary turn, and it's attention grabbing, and especially conjunct Uranus on April 20th in Taurus, it feels like that there's a new kind of inventive flavor that feels in Taurus, like in an earth sign, very much about anything tactile, anything having to do with all the Taurus significations. So like food production and is kind of what I have my eye on. Thinking about also shelter. Maybe we'll build like our communes finally, or our tiny houses and all live together. But it does have a lot of tiny houses. A lot of tiny houses together to live in community. But it does have that sort of like, okay, what can you imagine? What would be inventive? Because Uranus to me also has that sort of like paradigm breaking, that upgrade, that inventiveness, that mad scientist. And with Jupiter, how we're saying being the greater benefic, there's a resolution there. There's like a solve, and there's something that feels like it gives back to people in a way that's productive.
So what is some of the history that I know both of you dug into the history of the last time this happened in Taurus and found some fascinating correlations?
Okay, so I'll start first. So, this moment, Uranus takes about 84 years to circle the zodiac.
It's been 84 years.
Yeah. And so...
Does Eliza get that reference? Titanic.
I didn't even know that.
Okay. I laughed because it was funny, and I probably watched the Titanic as a child like 1,000 times, but I forgot that because I'm basically not on the internet. I did not get the meme. But thank you for breaking it down.
And so a lot of the what we're in right now, what we'll enter to in 2024 when we have Uranus conjunct Jupiter and Taurus, is at the same transit that happened on May 7th of 1941. And so if we start to anchor in time of what was going on then, it's really fascinating because there was like, as the US was about to enter the war, so US enters World War II in December of 1941, but meanwhile is all kind of giving supplies and manufacturing goods for wartime. And then as the women, white women, women of color, women who had traditionally not been in the workforce at that critical mass, then say, okay, we're going to enter the workforce. And so that's manufacturing goods. This is the whole Rosie the Riveter that we're kind of talking about right now.
Right. They certainly hadn't been in that type of work. Like, in like steel mill, whatever they were doing, like in those kinds of production lines and doing work that would have been thought of as quote unquote men's work.
Yeah. And so that feels revolutionary, that there took something that was a complete paradigm shift and a new kind of order in terms of roles. And I love that was happening in Taurus, in a Venus ruled sign, and women are entering the workforce and being like, no, we got this. And I'm thinking about even just the history of in being able to reflect, 84 some years later, however long it is, 80-ish, that even the way that we tell history, and that Rosie the Riveter is this white woman, we now know that there were what the history is being rewritten to show is that there were Black women who were on the workforce, that there's also like kind of this moment in time that will enter into 2024, echoing that moment. And so that was one way that seemed really stunning in terms of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, which we can loop back to. But the other thing that I found too was that at that time in 1941, that the Tuskegee Airmen were also training. So this is the all black squadron of Air Force that is training in Tuskegee, Alabama, to be able to pilot fighter craft in World War II, and how that also was a huge paradigm shift for Black men who, while they could be in the Army, there's a certain prestige with like being a pilot apparently. And so that was also groundbreaking. And so they do all that training while Uranus is at that part of Taurus.
So then you were saying that is also because of folks' experience in Europe, because of
Yes.
Black men's experience in Europe, that once returning back from that, because of that opening in terms of like getting the education, being able to move into that part of the workforce, and then experiences in Europe, that then they come back and...
Can you imagine being like, oh, I can exist as a human and outside, because Jim Crow was the law of the land in the South. And then, of course, we had other forms in the North. But the fact that once Black men, so Uranus at this part of like Taurus is also dancing between Taurus and Gemini. So it's really, this one was really stunning to me, because if we talk about Uranus and Gemini, that sort of, it was going back and forth, Gemini being an air sign, that then that invented, the training that they did, the inventions, the aircraft, all that kind of like preparing, and then they go and they travel. So that's air signs significations. They're
also
in
Jupiter.
Yeah. Right. And then there's a sort of reckoning that happens once people were able to experience a place where they could just be human and not have Jim Crow. Not saying Europe was perfect, obviously, but that there was...
it's the origin of all of it, but there's greater freedom, which is very Jupiterian.
Yeah.
So then they come back and that influences the origins of that part of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. And so that was a big thing, that once people were able to experience that level of freedom, that like you can't undo that. And so that also feels very Uranian to me, in terms of like, no, actually we need something different in this country.
And I'd argue that happened with women too.
Yes. So these are two different lenses. That's why history is so fascinating. I mean, we could just like spend a whole podcast on this probably. But that these groups that are subjugated. So it's like, we need your labor, we need your work, but the power structure then not realizing also that then inviting them into this fold then creates a certain, we've seen it, we know what's there. Like,
right.
We get feminism, we get civil rights movement.
Yeah. We get the next iteration of those things because they obviously already existed as well. But that there's that sense of expansion. So we're looking to this part of the year, I think all three of us, to say like, okay, well, what innovations will happen? What glass ceilings will be broken? What new paradigms might we enter into? And because, both of these gorgeous examples that Thea gave are about the economics of things and how political the economics of everything is, and that it's happening in Taurus, which is a sign of material reality in a lot of ways, like I think Thea said, food production, but also just like money and how the literal like physical world works that we live within now. So we're looking at some kind of perhaps breakthrough. Maybe, there's a lot to say about tech in 2024 because we enter into the year with Pluto moving back in for the first 9 months of the year into Aquarius. So there's that piece of it that this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is happening, with the background being Pluto re-entering into Aquarius. So there's a lot to be said about the masses, about people, about tech, about how it's all going to be influencing us. But I'm hoping that because it's in a Taurus, in Taurus and a Venus ruled sign, that this bodes well for women, for LGBTQ folks, for gender nonconforming folks, for those that might not have had the same kind of opportunities under colonial capitalist patriarchy.
It's such a stunning example. Thea, I really appreciate you highlighting these. It's such a stunning example of places where certain bodies were not allowed to go, and those people being able to transcend those boundaries. Like, whether that's women being outside the home, whether that's Black people being able to have more respect or just be treated as a human, as a person in society, in ways that were being completely violated and ignored in previous decades and centuries. I love that aspect of this. I also think it's no coincidence is the wrong word, but I want to also highlight that this is happening. This Jupiter-Uranus is happening also before Uranus will then enter Gemini in 2025. And I don't want to get too far ahead, but this sequence of events feels very crucial. And we did see that with the 1941, because with then too, Uranus entered Gemini the following year. And I want to just offer, I want to really raise up and highlight the positive that we've just been highlighting, but I also want to offer the flip side, the caution, especially with regards to technology, because what we saw specifically in the early 40s, 1941, when this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction happened, just imagine all of the technical advances that were happening behind the scenes to support the war effort. And some of those are crucial and like we've needed in society, and others have been devastating. And the one thing I want to highlight is actually when Jupiter did enter, when Uranus entered Jupiter, when Uranus entered Gemini in 1942, that coincided with the atomic bomb being created. But you can imagine that that people were working on that technology in labs like during that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And we spoke previously in another episode about AI and the advances of AI. And it just makes me wonder, like, again, we're making these advances, and I think sometimes
where are we going
with Jupiter, we can lean on the optimism and the excitement and the thrill of where we're going before we fully take in the consequences.
Wow, that's beautiful, Eliza. And when I looked at the charts, when the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction happens in Taurus, so in 1941, Pluto was at 2 Leo. And now Pluto is at 2, will be at 2 Aquarius. So it's the exact opposition.
Wow.
I found it just before we recorded. And I was like, wow. Okay, so we could be talking about people who have been at the exile, who have been at the margin. And but we could also be talking about the tech of it all and who has that power, who's creating the tech. Yeah. So
that chart is having its Pluto opposition too.
Yes.
But that's such a crucial point, because one of the things I think that is most scary about AI is that it's not exactly a diverse workforce who's creating these intelligences. And those intelligences are going to reflect the creators. And if those creators are like white dudes in their 30s living in Silicon Valley, that's a very specific, and I'm sure that's not exclusively who it is, but it's a very specific
who's in tech
demographic.
It's not a diverse demographic of folks that are in tech.
Should we talk about the conjunction in 1969? Because I do think that's interesting to loop in.
Yes, fascinating.
So this one is not in Taurus, but I do think it's like an interesting parallel along the same lines that we've been talking. So Jupiter and Uranus joined each other in Libra, another Venus ruled sign, on July 20th, 1969. And you may recall that happened to be the exact day of the moon landing. And hilariously, to me anyway, the moon was also in Libra. The moon had literally just touched this conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus. So again, we're seeing like paradigms completely breaking. One giant leap for mankind, as they said. Very Jupiter, but also very Uranian in that, like, where we had literally never tread before, literally a new world, a new
quantum leap.
A quantum leap, a new surface, to the point where I was like, I want to pull up the chart, but how do you do a chart for the location on the moon? Anyway, that was my own
new technology will come.
But that feels like a very stunning example. It makes me wonder what kind of advancements are going to happen with regards to, people's aspirations to travel to Mars or other places.
Do you get that question? I'm sorry.
What?
Like when people are like, what do we do with astrology on Mars?
Oh my God.
People always ask me that.
What do we do?
Skeptics. They're like, does it work?
Yeah. Of course you would. Anyways, because, I think that example like really struck me, Eliza, because we know that once we had images of the Earth from the vantage point of the moon, our entire self-perception changed, which I think is so Jupiter Uranus, because it's this expansive shift in understanding of like who we are and what it all means. So not to put too much pressure on this Jupiter Uranus conjunction, but it doesn't, sometimes it happens on the exact day, like with this moon landing situation. And then sometimes it's about the year and like how it kind of permeates and reverberates through. Okay. So do we have any, Thea, you did such a beautiful piece for the website about Pluto and the generations and like who was born under what Pluto sign. Your comment on the Pluto in Leo is making me think like all the boomers are going to be having their Pluto opposition. Do you have any comment on that? In terms of like Pluto changing signs and moving into Aquarius, God help me if anybody asks me about the age of Aquarius, because that's like definitely an article that the content team needs to write, I think, Eliza. But I'm not saying age of Aquarius because I don't think that is a thing. Anyways, it's a thing, but it's not a thing in the ways that we talk about it. But I do think like this Pluto into Aquarius is talking about a kind of revolutionary spirit amongst the masses. At least that's what it looked like the last time it was in. There was the French Revolution, the American Revolution, etc. But I'm just wondering about like the boomers reaching an age where they're coming to the end of their life at their Pluto opposition, which is what would happen. So do you want to say anything about Pluto and Leo folks that were born at the...
Yeah, it makes me think of like, what kind of legacy am I leaving? And is it beyond me? And I'm thinking about Pluto and Leo. And so like, I think it's the first generation that then once they come of age, like 2 decades later, is like, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to like live for me and all that means. And, the way that influenced pop culture. And I think now the narrative that's been happening is like, okay, well, you built all this for you, but now what about us? What about the younger generations? And so that opposition feels like, okay, so what am I giving? What is my legacy for past me, for my family, for the community? That I think is like this really interesting mirror.
And then the Pluto and Scorpio generation, which I don't know if both of you are that, but you're all you're all having your Pluto square Pluto.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Reminder.
Yeah. I mean, it's a long transit. It will last for 20 years or so, but depending on where your Pluto is in Scorpio. But
you know what I thought about a lot with Pluto and Leo being boomers, and then we get millennials with Pluto and Scorpio. And like when, 15, 20 years ago, whenever I was going into the workforce, there was just like, these millennials, they are so emo. They don't want to work. They're so sensitive. I mean, it was so scorpionic, like, but also like the things that we witnessed coming of age in that really pivotal time were
like 2008, like the
collapse, those systems that were supposed to be put in place. I remember you can feel that square tension between those two generations. Like, well, this was supposed to be set up for us, but now none of this is guaranteed. Like I graduated in 2007 and then entering the workforce for all the people that generation, there were like literally no jobs. People instead went and like did volunteer trips or I don't know, went back to school. There was a real reckoning in that way too, with the systems that were supposed to hold us.
What do you both see now for your generation coming into the first part of your Pluto square Pluto? Now that you're moving, you're all, millennials are getting older.
Well, I think like one thing that's important to highlight with all of this is Pluto for all of the above, Pluto in fixed signs. And I think what we're all confronting in very different ways are conceptions about the world that we hold so deeply to be true. And I do think we've seen in various contexts, I think we've seen Pluto and Leo people be really challenged with new worldviews, with new realities, and in a way that feels like what I've witnessed is that can be received by them as a personal attack on them. Not it's like another person's paradigm shift or context change is somehow denying like intimately their personhood. I mean, that can be that can be a friction that I've witnessed. But I think we see that in a different way with the Pluto and Scorpio generation, where suddenly, because I feel like Pluto and Scorpio, maybe this is every generation, but what I'm feeling is I was always the youngest person in the room, and now I'm not.
Ella, that's every generation.
That's every generation. But
that's just called aging.
But I do think there's something about the Pluto and Scorpio, like our claim to fame is like Peter Pan syndrome and just like living with our parents forever and never growing up. And suddenly we're like, we really are expected to be grown-ups. But I think there's certain conceptions and certain pessimisms that we had around the world, and then now suddenly you see people, we spoke about Sam Altman in the last podcast that we did, but you see people who you see this in the tech sector a lot, people who they dropped out of college, and like there might have been moments where maybe the Pluto and Leo generation would be frowning upon that, like, what are you going to do with your life? You're dropping out of Stanford, and then they're running these incredibly powerful companies. And so there's like a positionality shift.
It's a lot about your power. Yeah.
It's a lot about our power. And I think there's a reckoning of like, I can imagine there being a reckoning with like, oh, we actually do have power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
what are we doing?
Are we recognizing that? Are we recognizing our privileges in that?
Okay. Sorry, that was a big divergent, but I think it's really fascinating. I think these like generational shifts are really important.
And then there's more, like you could get into the Neptune and the
yeah. So, okay, so do either of you want to say anything about Pluto and Aquarius? I mean, it's like one of the bigger things. We didn't even really talk about it that much. We kind of like glossed over it, but Pluto goes into Aquarius in January 19th,
19th,
and it's there until September 1st. Look at me with the dates. Hey. And so we've got this first like 9-month term, and it's the second time we've got Pluto in Aquarius. So we've been here a little bit before. We saw major headlines about France, about the revolutions that were, about the uprising stuff that was happening there. We saw tons of stuff about AI at that time. And so I'm expecting for us to go back to some of those ideas, some of those themes. Are either of you expecting more of that, to something different? Is there anything you're looking out for in terms of this first 9 months of 2024 and Pluto and Aquarius?
I definitely am watching it in terms of what are the power players, like who's going to be making moves? Because again, it's like a 9-month, then it goes back out, then it comes back in November. 2024. So it feels like who is, I think a lot about these like tech disruptors who we didn't vote for and who actually don't govern, but who hold a shit ton of power. And so, I mean, that's the kind of theme I'll be seeing, like watching what power we've given up. I mean, I'm also thinking about like just data privacy in particular. Maybe this is darker. The dark web feels very Pluto and Aquarius.
Very.
And all of those things that we kind of, gave up in the pandemic in order for convenience to connect. And now I think we'll kind of I will be like thinking about, okay, like, so what does that mean that we can all connect so easily? And like what data is available to folks and all that kind of, that's the new lay of the land in terms of power. But the good thing about it is that we can all organize. We can like invest in our communities and realize that is the source of our strength and our effectiveness.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, but definitely like storylines about what satellites Elon Musk is allowing, marginalized communities and repressed societies to access or not. That kind of like absolute, like power like no person has ever had before on the earth because of the tech, and how that leads to such kind of mass injustice. And so what will we do in the face of that? How will we organize around that? So we'll see like communication changes. We'll see something about tech. We'll see something about collectively how we're responding to that. There's also I don't know, Thea, I think you've also done a lot of work on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is also the official last year of the United States Pluto return. Right. And so the United States chart has Pluto at late degrees of Capricorn. And so the first couple days of January and then that section of September, October, November. September, October, November. Do you notice anything about those months being important to America this year in 2024? Those are the last couple months of the United States' Pluto return. And we are just so happening to have an election. And so we will be choosing whether we have who we're going to have. And obviously, the last time that Uranus was moving between Taurus and Gemini, we were dealing with global fascism. Not that it ever really goes away, but there are times where it peaks. And definitely this is another one of those times. And so like world order and who wins, who gets in, all of that stuff just feels wild to me that that's the last little window of Pluto and Capricorn is during those months. I'm not saying it's bad for us. I'm saying that there's like a return to the origins of this country and where it all went wrong. And if we do not reckon with the shadow, which is very Pluto, we do not reckon of the shadow of the origins of this country, which is mass slavery and settler colonization, which is just a death machine. If we don't reckon with that, we end up just reliving trauma of it in different ways and the injustice of it in different ways. And it gets splintered off into all of these weird realities. But that I think truly is the calling of the United States Pluto return.
That's beautiful. I mean, this is a year I become a political astrologer. So
hey,
I want to get into the ZR of all the like candidates charts. We're gonna.
What's ZR, Thea?
ZR is a timing technique called Zodiacal releasing, and
Thea's amazing. She's our resident ZR.
I don't know, but no, all of what you said. There's so many places to go, but this, okay, Eliza, I think you had something.
I was just going to say, this thought is not original to me. I've heard a lot of astrologers say this, but I think there's always potential for healing in the return. And it's exactly what you're saying, Chani. I think we have no choice. We have to reckon with this history. And
that is how we transmute. That is how we transform. That is magic. That is alchemy. And if that alchemy doesn't happen, it's rotting. It is rotting substance in our psyche. And we know it and we feel it and it's everywhere. And I think, Thea, you had this sentiment that like living amongst ghosts.
The haunted house.
The haunted
Pluto
house.
at the end of Cap and then coming back in. Yeah, we can't build anything off of that. So
right.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note, we've said this in 1,000 places, but I don't think we've said it in this podcast. But the last time Pluto was in Aquarius, it coincided with the American Revolution. It coincided with the French Revolution. So I'm not saying, therefore, history shall repeat itself and there shall be these revolutions. But I do wonder, what does transference of power mean today? What could that look like? And what could that look like in a way that's it doesn't need to be violent, but like, what is the best way that we could imagine that happening and reclaiming that power for ourselves and redistributing it?
When Pluto was by the time it entered Aquarius, I think for the US, that's when they were like, what kind of constitution do we want? So the revolution, they were like, how do we, so that part feels very Aquarian, because we were like, people should vote. Like, but then of course, not all people. So this is when we have a chance to redo and to make right and to actually give something back to the people.
Rewrite the Constitution.
I'm down.
Listen.
Should we talk about Jupiter and Gemini?
Let's. Okay, I'm obsessed with this book right now. And again, this is November 30th. So I don't know when you're listening to this, but you probably have already heard me talk about it a million times. But there's a book that Naomi Klein, not Naomi Wolf, wrote called Doppelganger. And I just think, well, it's my homework for everybody for preparation for Jupiter into Gemini, because it is such a fascinating look into this very universal kind of archetype of the other, the doppelganger, the shadow, the one we project all of our stuff onto. It is about the splintering off of opinions and facts. And I think that Jupiter in Gemini is in a sign of what we call its detriment or exile. And so one of Jupiter's things is about faith and, again, openness and saying yes and having an understanding of what the law is and what morality is and like what our moral compass and what our belief is and how to have faith and hope. And so when the planet that's responsible for all that is in its exile, is in the sign opposite from it, we know that we're entering into a period of time where we're going to struggle with those ideas. We're going to struggle with those ways of being. And I think we all know Gemini is excellent at talking about 70 things at once, at like splaying attention spans in a million different directions, in diversion, in a great scattering of information, whether it's right or wrong, whatever, it doesn't matter. There's a proliferation of ideas. The proliferation part is the Jupiter, and the ideas part is the Gemini. So what ideas are going to be put out into the world and really magnified? We're having Jupiter and Gemini at the same time, as some of it is going to be overlapping with Pluto and Aquarius. So we know that there's just a ton about information and tech. And I think this understanding of so Gemini is the twins. And so we understand Gemini is like chatty and bubbly and blah, 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 but it has a twin. It has another side. It has a side that's quiet and contemplative and still, as much as it is in motion and is effervescent. It is deep and goes like, there has to be, one is always with the other. And so this twinning of doppelganging politics is that there's a splintering off of the truth, right? And so how do we get in between and maybe even start to hold space for the ways in which so much projection happens in our political climate right now, that we refuse to be in a binary and we instead hold space for a third option, which is to say that we are going to understand we're going into a situation that is going to be very challenging in terms of our, I think, conversations with each other and keeping facts and data straight, because Jupiter is going to be in Gemini for the later part of what we spring in the northern hemisphere and into the rest of the year. And this is very American centric, but we're going into an election, as I said. And so we know that globally, this is an important election. It just is. That's just how the states are still positioned. So we want to think about, how do we neutralize these paradoxes? How do we hold space for conflicting information and conflicting or multiple truths at once and still move towards what is just and what is at the center of our moral compass, or moving with our moral compass intact? And I've said a lot. Do either of you want to jump in?
I'm thinking about how you said Jupiter and Gemini might not care about the right or wrong. And it feels like with Saturn and Pisces squaring Jupiter, that it's asking that rigor to not to have a certain responsibility to the truth, and to refuse binaries, and it's going to be hard because there'll be so much information coming at us, but it feels very important to constantly be circling back. Is this right? Is this something that is vetted? Is this something that I have a certain responsibility to my words and what I say, even if what's coming at me? I mean, it'll be an election year, so it'll be like, the bots will be on the grams or whatever. But at the end of the day, it feels like a certain medicine is like, is this what I choose to express and disseminate, and to be responsible to that?
I'm thinking a lot about how to build capacity for having really difficult conversations. For those of us that can and that do have the capacity to have those difficult conversations, how do we build and strengthen that muscle within us psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually? Jupiter goes into Gemini May 25th.
Part of what I think about with this, Chani, you had shared with Thea and I a podcast with Naomi Klein, and they were talking about some
Jewish
of the
currents.
Jewish currents on the nose.
Yeah.
Podcast,
Sorry.
really?
Thank you. Yeah.
And one of the ideas that really struck me with regards to this conversation, and I think it gets to the heart of what we're all saying here, whatever side of the political spectrum you find yourself on, I think both sides are guilty of, or can be guilty of, having this bad guy, good guy narrative. And that is how we create exiles. That is actually how we exile one another.
Yes.
And then what happens to
exile,
a person that we then exile from our community. And so to actually not only hold space for difficult conversations, but to hold space for a complexity of both and, in which two things can be true at once, even if they seem contradictory.
Yeah.
And the moment we enter into a projection, then we need to circle back to ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to not exile, because what happens is when we exile a person, we exile a part of ourselves. And we buy into a narrative that there are good guys and bad guys. And that is colonization.
Yeah.
That is how colonization proliferates.
Yeah.
That is saying someone is less human than another person. That is white supremacy. That is patriarchy. And our main task, I think, right now is how to think and be and feel and act outside of those systems. And we swim in them, we drink the water, we breathe the air. And so it is a huge ask of us. But I think in the ways in which we can do it, that is one of the most important skills for us to strengthen, because my, spidey senses are going out to like July, August. And in August, especially, Mars enters Gemini, will make a conjunction with Jupiter, and both of them will square Saturn. Why is that a problem? At the same time as Mercury is retrograde. Mercury is ruling all of this, and Mercury will be retrograde. Why is that a problem? Go.
Okay, I'll jump in first. One of the reasons, well, there's multiple reasons, because this is happening in mutable signs. So it feels like that the difficulty comes from many different places all at once.
Yeah.
And Mars is going to sort of inflame and activate any of the that aggressive principle. And so it's, but it's again, squaring Saturn at the same time. Jupiter makes things bigger. So then Jupiter, Mars it feels super inflamed. And this idea of entering to difficult conversations, I mean, that just feels like a time to leave a lot of space for them and to leave a lot of space for being open. Sometimes when I'm like, I have to have a difficult conversation, that it might change based on the facts that change. So that like having patience for things as they evolve and change, and to be open, man, if we could just listen to each other, practice listening, that might also be a good medicine for that time period. But August looks
dicey. Yeah.
Dicey.
It's funny because I don't love a Mars Saturn square. Again, these are the two more challenging planets traditionally, and they're in an aspect that is challenging. A square aspect is friction, it's chafing. At the same time, I strangely, and maybe I'll bite my words or eat my words later, but there's something about Saturn and Pisces that feels like we need this remediating reminder of taking responsibility, of slowing down, of not jumping to conclusions. I feel like Mars and Gemini conjunct Jupiter is going to jump to all the conclusions. It's going to have all of the hot takes.
All of them.
And I think that Saturn is actually a really remedial presence there to just say, hey now, like slow down.
What is your superior square?
It has a superior square. What's interesting too, though, is Saturn is in Jupiter's sign.
Yes.
So it's like answering to Jupiter in that square.
But Jupiter's ruled by Mercury, and Mercury's
which is retrograde. It's not, again, it's a little messy, but I feel like we do need some of that Saturnian. I never say this, but I feel like we do need some of that Saturnian energy just to keep Jupiter and Gemini like not so chaotic. Maybe.
Yes, totally. Do you think there'll be a tech meltdown at that time?
I mean, there was last time, but Mars was in Gemini. So this is also the first time Mars has been in Gemini since it was retrograde in that sign, in which we saw all of the tech industry melting.
We saw Twitter fully, that's when Elon took over, right?
And it also Meta, like all of the companies were laying off everybody. It was not a fun time to be.
Right. So we might be returning back to some kind of iteration of a tech, like wobbliness.
But Mars isn't retrograde, and it is co-present. Even though it's in detriment, it is co-present with the greater benefic. So I think it could be more constructive.
Ruled by a Mercury retrograde. Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see.
But I do think I would voter registration shenanigans. All of that kind of stuff. I'm very so. This is my thing for late May onwards. It's like, how do we have small sprints of focused action? Because the last thing anything in Gemini has is focus. It has variety, and it has curiosity, which is great.
The spice of life.
Yeah. We need to stay really curious for sure. But how do we, if August is an important year, or an important time in 2024, which, an election year, it is. So how do we be like, okay, August could be messy. How do we show up for it in the ways that we can, so that we gather people and move them in a direction, and then kind of like let it go? And I say that, like, let it go and then gather them again, because I think anything that's going to be too long of an arc of needed concentration will be hard to be successful with. But I think small sprints of intensive concentration could work. And you can argue with me if you think that's not a good way to go for this. But like, how do we help people, especially folks that are activists and organizers, work with this Jupiter and Gemini clusterfuck, at least in August?
I would also say sprinting is probably best done earlier in the year because, and this is maybe a good segue, like Mars will be going retrograde in December, on December 6th in Leo.
Wow.
And that's how we end the year.
It is how we end the year with a Mars retrograde. And I honestly don't know how to think about the Mars retrograde except for the theatrics of it all, because it's stationing retrograde in Leo. But I think I need to get through the election before I even understand what the Mars retrograde.
We'll be talking about it next year on the podcast.
It's the planet of action, though, that's slowing down. So I feel like it's not a time for sprinting, just to like create that bridge.
Yeah.
At the end of the year, and it does feel... Well, I know we need to get through the election before we really know how to interpret that. But I think what's important to note is in the Mars retrograde in Gemini, we felt that slowdown. Like that we saw it stationed retrograde at the very end of October in 2022, but we saw shenanigans happening all through the month, I would say. So Mars will be in its shadow and slowing down all through election season.
In October. It enters its shadow in October.
Okay, maybe not technically in its shadow, but I think we'll still be feeling the effects of Mars slowing down during the lead up to the election.
Yeah. Okay. So if you feel fatigued by it all, just I do like the sprint and to like just gather yourself, rest, come back. Especially if you're doing the work for folks who are activists, and we all have our areas where we can cause change.
Yeah.
So,
should we give the people some kind of positive notes to work with? The first The last like 3-4 weeks of January are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
There is a period where Venus will go into Pisces. That is lovely. That's also at the beginning of the year. At least it's the like opening part of the year, which is March 11th. Venus will move into Pisces, which is lovely for connection and pleasure. It'll be there until April 4th. So we've got that month, basically the month of March, to enjoy Venus in Pisces. And then there is some beautiful, beautiful, beautiful astrology we've got in May. So May 18th, we've got a Jupiter cazimi in Taurus, and it's sextiling Neptune, and Venus is close by. And then on May 23rd, we've got a Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Taurus, also sextiling Neptune, which is gorgeous. And it is such, I think, a fertile like moment that's full of like good growth energy. And then I think that there are some interesting things that are happening in Gemini in June that do also feel quite helpful. We've got Jupiter that just trines Pluto for the first time on June 2nd. We've got June 4th. Venus makes a cazimi, so it moves into the heart of the sun in Gemini. And so that feels really good for like social life and getting a message out. And there's a Mercury cazimi in Gemini, although it is separating from a square to Saturn, but that could help to keep the concentration. And so there's really like a lot of good stuff sprinkled throughout the year. We are focusing on things that are kind of like bigger and heftier. But again, if you get a guidebook, if you get the Astro planner that we put out, or listen to your year ahead readings, I upfront tell you all of the good stuff to work with and how to work with it.
We highlight them in the guidebooks as well.
Okay. So there's a lot of good things to work with. And we always want to be able to say, like, I always get asked, when is it going to get easy? And it's like, it's life. Life doesn't get easy. Life just is what it is. The astrology is what it is. It's up to us how we work with it, how we show up to it. If we have a world that centers liberation, then hard astrology won't be that hard. It won't be the same kind of disasters, right? Like, so it's up to us to rebuild the world so that when the astrology looks a little daunting, we're like, okay, well, maybe that'll be like not the greatest day, but it's not going to feel as intense. And there's always pockets of really helpful, beautiful little notes that when we work with them, we are seeding what it is we want to live into, so that when the more challenging pieces of astrology come, we've got that as a buffer and maybe even as a good luck charm.
I love that. I think that's the perfect note to end on.
That's perfect. Thank you, Chani.
And we'll be back with more like, month to month, kind of parsing all of this out. So thank y'all so much for joining us. Find us over on the Chani app. I am Chani Nicholas.
I'm Thea Anderson.
And I'm Eliza Robertson.
And we wish you the best, most revolutionary, most liberated, most joyful 2024.
Happy New Year.